Security Advisor Mike Waltz was grilled by reporters yesterday about President Trump's comments on the war in Ukraine, and he dodged the questions. Take a look.
The president has called Zelensky a dictator. Does he view Putin as a dictator? And does he want Zelensky out of power? I know he's called for elections.
Look, President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky. The fact that that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will get to that point, and I hope so very quickly.
While Waltz might not have had an answer to the simple question as to whether Trump views Putin as a dictator, the New York Post sure does, publishing this front page headline today. The Murdoch Doe newspaper simply says, President Trump, this is a dictator, with a picture of Putin. This comes as the president's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia met with Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel brings us the latest.
President Zelensky is changing his tune, suggesting overnight he's now open to discussing a deal. President Trump is demanding for Ukraine to hand over 50% of its mineral rights in exchange for continued American support. After meeting with Trump's envoy, retired General Keith Kellogg, President Zelensky gave his nightly address, saying economy and security must always go hand in hand, and the details of the agreements matter. Zelensky also laid out what he expects in return, calling for a reliable and clear system of security guarantees that ensure long-term protection from Russia. American and Ukrainian officials tell NBC News the Trump administration presented Zelensky with the proposed mineral deal last week, giving him an hour to sign it. Zelensky refused, saying it didn't make security guarantees explicit. He was told Trump would be angry. And President Trump did respond angrily, falsely accusing Zelensky of being a dictator, and now making it clear he wants that deal signed.
Can you resurrect that deal? Is there anything that you can do?
I think I'm going to resurrect it. Or, we'll see what happens, but I'm going to resurrect it, or things are not going to make him too happy.
In Ukraine this morning, at a rehabilitation center for soldiers just back from the front lines, some say they feel like they're being squeezed by the United States. But Sergeant Volodymyr Chaika doesn't oppose the deal in principle after what he's seen in combat over the last 3 years.
Some critics have said that President Trump is exploiting Ukraine, is taking advantage of its position right now in order to extract resources. You, as someone who's fought for this country so much, what do you think about that?
Between two evils, you have to pick the better one, he says. If I have to choose between the United States and the possibility that Russia will take over our country, I pick the United States.
And just moments ago, following his meeting with President Zelensky, that special envoy, Keith Kellogg, striking a rather different tone than President Trump when it comes to how they describe the Ukrainian leader. Kellogg just posted this on social media: a long and intense day with the senior leadership of Ukraine. Extensive and positive discussions with Zelensky, the embattled and courageous leader of a nation at war, and his talented national security team. So, Joe, I mean, that's Keith Kellogg doing a 180 from what we've heard from Trump, calling him, Zelensky, a dictator. But I think it's telling Kellogg not part of those initial talks with Russia. He's someone who is widely disliked in Moscow. So this, again, harkens back to our conversation of a few hours ago. Sometimes the Trump administration in the first term did things very differently than the president himself. It was much harder on Russia. We might be seeing a similar dynamic here, or does Trump just simply run roughshod? Only time will tell.
Well, like we said a couple of hours ago, look at the people who are around Donald Trump. And General Kellogg has a great reputation as somebody that will stand and fight for freedom. And that freedom, of course, means pushing back against Russian aggression and trying to get a deal that ultimately protects Ukraine. As we said, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he is a cold warrior, and he earns his stripes from his family fleeing communist Cuba. Same thing, of course, we had Mike Waltz on earlier. Mike Waltz has been a cold warrior as well, tough both on Russia and also tough on China. And so, Peter Baker, going back to the first term, we always talk about, and not just because Jonathan's right here with us, but we always talk about that question John asked in Helsinki, and Donald Trump saying that he trusted Vladimir Putin more than his own intel agency. At the same time, things like that were going on that would shock the conscience of anybody that knows anything about foreign policy. Donald Trump's Vice President Mike Pence would be in Europe, and he would be delivering a speech against Russia that Ronald Reagan could have delivered. And so it is interesting, and we always talk about what happened with the Republicans in Donald Trump's first term, passing some of the toughest sanctions on Russia yet. So, again, the New York Post, exactly right. We are dealing with a dictator in Russia. It is going to be interesting to see if Donald Trump's second term regarding Russia plays out like his first term did.
Yeah, I mean, look, is Keith Kellogg playing the good cop to Trump's bad cop in a deliberate way, or is there, is he off the reservation? And he's not been, I mean, even though he's supposedly the special envoy for Ukraine, he's not been the person at the table in Saudi Arabia with the Russians when Marco Rubio sat down. So a lot of people assume he's been sidelined or marginalized. And so when he says what he said in that post today, is that him sort of pushing back a little bit, or is that him, helping, in his view, helping Trump try to mitigate the damage that he's caused by going after Zelensky? Because look, what this has done, this has been good for Zelensky domestically in terms of his own political standing. This has helped consolidate support behind Zelensky again against Trump, because a lot of Ukrainians, even who might not be happy with Zelensky right now, certainly don't like the way Trump has characterized him or characterized their role, their responsibility for the war, as if somehow they invaded themselves.
Tesla shares have dropped 20% in value since Inauguration Day. Tesla sales in Europe have taken huge hits recently, down 40 or 50% or more in the largest markets in Europe. Overall, in the last year, globally, electric vehicle sales are up 25%, but Tesla sales are down 1%. And down 1% may not seem like that big a deal, even as the overall market for that type of vehicle is going up. But consider that minus 1% of that drop in Tesla sales this year follows the last 2 years in which Tesla sales were up 38% and up 40%. And now this year they're minus 1. Now, how does that kind of thing affect his ultimate role in what he's doing to our government and what he thinks of his public image, and what he's making the public think of him? I don't know, but I think the most reasonable thing to expect is that it's going to be unpredictable, because I think there's a lot of weird variables at play here. I mean, obviously, this is a personal crusade of his to destroy as much of the constitutional republic as he can, without any regard at all for him having any legitimate government authority or following any laws. The personal dynamic, in addition, between this campaign donor and the president himself is very unusual, given that the president seems to have personally empowered this guy without actually giving him a government job. So the personal dynamic between them is all that Elon Musk has to stand on in terms of what he is doing to our government. The dynamic between them is weird, in which the president is effectively sidelined while Elon Musk takes center stage. The president, in contrast, appears to be weak and sort of beside the point, while his campaign donor regularly upstages him and talks over him, both in interviews and in the Oval Office. I mean, that would be hard to take for even the least egotistical president. It remains to be seen how we'll play out with this one. Along those lines, I have to say, this is also very strange, late-breaking news. I'm not quite sure what to do with this at all, but you should know. CNN was first to report today that the Trump administration has made an unusual decision with regard to Elon Musk's phalanx of private personal bodyguards. Now, NBC has not confirmed this, but CNN is reporting, based on 3 law enforcement sources, that the administration had the U.S. Marshals Service officially deputize members of Elon Musk's team of private bodyguards. And that may sound like kind of a bureaucratic designation, but one practical consequence of that is that the Marshals Service may now allow Musk's team of personal bodyguards to carry weapons on federal property. Loaded weapons. CNN reports, quote, some people close to Trump's White House have been taken aback by the scale of security that has surrounded Elon Musk since he became a regular presence in Trump's orbit last year. Musk's security detail rivaled only that of the president himself, the sources observed. But now, with this decision by the U.S. Marshal Service, now Trump and Musk, when they're in the same place, like in the White House or on other federal property, they're both going to be surrounded by equally huge phalanxes of armed guards. One set of them, the Secret Service, presumably loyal to Trump, and the other set, also armed but private and loyal to Musk. But everybody's going to have their weapons? Sure, that's not weird at all. That's definitely not like Monty Python crossed with Shakespeare at all. What could possibly go wrong? Donald Trump has thus far spent 10 of his 31 full days in office at one of his golf clubs. 10 of the 31 days. Donald Trump has not taken a foreign trip since he's been back in the White House. He has signed a grand total of one bill. He has taken an almost cartoonishly outsized interest in posing with big maps that say Gulf of America on them. And although the White House then picked a fight with the Associated Press, trying to force the AP to use that terminology rather than use the Gulf of Mexico, which is what it is, today in an interview when Trump was asked about that, he appeared sort of confused. He didn't seem to even understand that his White House had banned the Associated Press. In fact, saying in an interview today that they could come back whenever they want, even though he's the one who supposedly banned them. I mean, when President Trump isn't playing golf, he has taken multiple meetings about his golf investments. He has gone to the Super Bowl. He had somebody drive him around the track at the Daytona 500. Whee! That literally had him drive around the track. I mean, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say he is not the busiest man in the world. He appears to be sort of decorative at this point, while the person who's really working double time to make the government actually do things appears to be his top campaign donor, who is getting all the attention and all the credit. And while Trump is, playing race cars and golf and enjoying the worst approval ratings of any new president in the history of polling, and they are getting worse with every passing day, meanwhile, here's just a partial list of the things that Elon Musk and his own companies have somehow reaped from the U.S. government while Trump was, putting. Headline, Justice Department to drop discrimination case against Elon Musk's SpaceX. The Justice Department had filed the case against SpaceX in August 2023, accusing the company of violating federal law in its hiring practices. Yesterday, quote, the Justice Department said it intended to file a notice of dismissal with prejudice, which means prosecutors would not be able to file these charges again. The motion did not say why the case was being dropped. So check that one off his list. Headline, Doge employee cuts fall heavily on agency that regulates Musk's Tesla. A small government team regulating the sort of autonomous cars that Elon Musk says represent the future of Tesla, his car company, is getting cut nearly in half by the Musk-led U.S. Doge service. Check that one off his list. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration investigation in 2023 led to a National Highway Transportation Safety Administration investigation in 2023 led to a recall of 2 million Tesla vehicles. The same agency disclosed in April that it had documented numerous deadly crashes involving Tesla Autopilot. Now, thanks to Elon Musk's Doge, that same agency, the NHTSA, is losing about 10% of its workforce. Check that one off the list. Tesla, I should note, this year plans to put fully autonomous vehicles on the road this year. Yeah, and if you keep gutting the agency that regulates that sort of thing, who'll be there to stop them? Who'll be able to stop them before the crosswalk? Here's another headline. Fate of Rivian's $6.6 billion federal loan now hangs in the balance. Fortune magazine helpfully nuts up the key point at the top of this one. Quote, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp says he does not know whether the Trump administration will honor the contracts of the Biden administration. Quote, if the loan is canceled, Tesla CEO Elon Musk stands to benefit the most. Check Rivian off the list. Who needs that competitor? This comes after the Trump administration already cut off federal funds for the National Electric Vehicle Charging Network, which leaves Elon Musk's Tesla unchallenged as the largest charging network in the country. Never mind that he took huge U.S. government subsidies to build Tesla and to build that charging network. Now that he's done that and he's the biggest game in town, the Trump administration is pulling up the ladder so nobody else can compete with him. Nice work if you can get it. Check that one off the list. The FAA chairman who grounded Musk's Starship rocket program after it catastrophically disintegrated on a botched launch and sprayed debris all over the Caribbean and caused the diversion of dozens of flights. Musk had repeatedly demanded that FAA chair should resign. He resigned on Inauguration Day. And aviation security has been awesome ever since, right? At the FDA, they have fired the people who were overseeing Elon Musk's Neuralink brain implant company. At the USDA, they fired the Inspector General who was investigating Neuralink for its animal experimentation. At the Defense Department, they fired the Inspector General investigating Elon Musk over his alleged refusal to detail his contacts and ties with foreign governments, including our foreign adversaries. The Labor Department has multiple open investigations of Tesla. Trump's nominee for Labor Secretary would not commit either way at her confirmation hearing on whether she would allow Elon Musk and his Doge team to have access to those investigations of him at the Labor Department or to any other investigations involving his business rivals. Also, at least one U.S. government agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, has announced that it will only henceforth communicate with the public through Elon Musk's privately held social media company.
Well, we're going to begin tonight with the groundswell of outrage at the dismantling of the federal government. Now, I mean, to be fair, if all you listen to is the bragging of Donald Trump and Elon Musk and their MAGA-land allies on Fox, Newsmax, and CPAC, and wherever else all these people listen to things, about them talking about how great everything is going with Doge and their mission to bring a chainsaw to the federal government, you might think for a moment, well, maybe this is going well for Trump. Maybe he's delivering on his plans. Maybe people like this. But in my many, many years in politics, one of the things I've found is that there is nothing like a congressional recess where members go home to their districts to give you a very good sense of exactly how things are actually going. I mean, just ask Congressman Rich McCormick. He's a pretty run-of-the-mill Republican member. He represents a red district in Georgia, which he won by 30 points, by the way, in November. He's probably not someone you'd see making the rounds on MAGA TV every single day, pushing Trump's talking points. I don't even know, and I've lived here for a long time, that I could even pick him out of a Republican lineup. And yet, despite being relatively anonymous on the national stage and holding what seems to be a pretty safe Republican seat for Congress, Congressman McCormick was not exactly welcomed home at a town hall meeting in Roswell, Georgia last night.
You can go and yell all you want, but I can't understand 10 people, let alone 100 people at once.
They said Georgia budget, not the president. And you are doing us a disservice to set that down and not stand up for us. And
a lot of this stuff will be litigated. Litigated in court. You don't think I'm going to stand up for you? Stand up. So if we're going to have a town hall, and I'm going to come and stand in front of you and take your questions and try to answer them as honestly as I can, then let's do that, okay? But if you're going to just yell at me, that's not going to be an effective town hall.
Now, multiple attendees specifically took issue with Musk's so-called chainsaw approach at Doge.
I want to say that from a conservative perspective, the approach of DOJ is completely 180 degrees. They've been indiscriminate and they've taken a chainsaw to these things.
I understand trying to do more with less. That's reasonable. What's not reasonable is taking this chainsaw approach. Why is this being jammed down the pipe so rushed and sloppily?
Now, the repeated use of chainsaw does kind of make you wonder if they saw this at CPAC yesterday and thought it was as weird as we did.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw! That's perfect. All right.
As the NBC affiliate in Atlanta reports, there were so many folks in the attendance ready to give McCormick a piece of their mind, the venue actually ran out of room.
There were a couple hundred people who came out here tonight filling council chambers. Then the rest filled up overflow rooms inside City Hall. It was standing room only. Dozens of people, in fact, who showed up here on this very cold night were actually turned away because, again, there was too many people inside City Hall.
Now, what happened in Roswell, Georgia, that we've just seen footage of, was the result of a combination of things: an intentional grassroots organizing effort and regular everyday folks who were just fed up with what Trump and Musk are doing. It was not an isolated incident either. I mean, just this morning, Republican Congressman Glenn Grothman of Wisconsin got an earful from his constituents near Oshkosh.
If Elon Musk is there, he will be able to raise questions, and because of his fame and financial success, I think all of a sudden he is going to be able to force Congress to look at things like aircraft carriers, which wouldn't happen otherwise, okay? Obviously, President Trump has issued a lot of executive orders. I think by and large this is moving very quickly compared to other administrations, and I think across the board, he's done some very good things. I think.
I mean, there was a lot packed in there. There was laughing as he tried to explain Elon Musk's effectiveness and power. There was booing. There was a lot of response in there, is one way to say it. But here's the larger point. I mean, similar scenes played out at Republican town halls in West Bend, Wisconsin, and Baker City, Oregon. And in some ways, it reminded me a little bit of the Tea Party protests we saw at town halls in 2009 and 2010, which was an early indicator of the Republicans sweeping Congress. Now, there's a long time before that, and there are definitely some clear differences between then and now, because the Affordable Care Act was not sending your grandma to death panels, as those Tea Party protesters claimed. And Elon Musk is actually openly boasting about what he's doing to the government that people at these town halls are mad about. But like the start of those 2009 protests, there does seem to be some real grassroots momentum here, enough that Donald Trump had to address it today.
Some members of Congress in red districts are facing pushback from voters in town halls. We know that Americans voted for you on immigration and the economy, but these voters say they're angry and frustrated by these firings. They don't like the work of Elon Musk and these other actions. What do you say to them?
Let me just tell you that I have today the highest poll numbers I've ever had. I have today the highest poll numbers of any Republican president ever. They like the job that Elon's doing. He's doing something that a lot of people wouldn't have the courage to do. So it's actually just the opposite. We've polled it, and people are thrilled. They can't even believe it's happening. And it won't affect many people. It'll only affect the people that get caught stealing.
There is a lot packed in there. But to be clear, he's lying. I mean, these thousands of fired workers were not caught stealing. That tone is definitely one of a person who's not exactly confident in the actions of the person they are being asked to defend. And for the record, the opposite is actually true about the polls. People don't like what Musk and Trump are doing. New polls from CNN and Gallup and the Washington Post all have Trump with a negative approval rating. And as the Washington Post notes, Americans disapprove by a 2-to-1 margin of Musk shutting down federal agencies that he decides are unnecessary. And most, 63%, are concerned that his team is gaining access to sensitive personal data of individuals for good reason, because they are. Now, that doesn't sound very popular to me. Sound popular to you? We're just over a month into the Trump administration, and one day of uncomfortable town hall meetings definitely does not flip the House to Democratic control in Congress next year. But it is a sign that people are mad, and that this may not be shaping up to be what they voted for. That's important.
Mr. Allen, to you first. The former Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown. This man spent 4 decades in the military. He's a fighter pilot with thousands of hours of flight time. He's an instructor. This man has flying in combat, I think something like 300 hours. What should we make of his firing and the tonight's shakeups at the Pentagon? One can't say he wasn't qualified for the job.
No, he was certainly qualified for the job, Stephanie, and also in a job that's largely supposed to be apolitical. What we can make of his firing is that he was caught up in basically what President Trump describes as an effort to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the government. C.Q. Brown had spoken out during the Black Lives Matter movement about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and we've seen that in our armed forces over the years with the integration of the military before many other institutions were integrated in the United States. So what we've seen here is basically a bloodbath at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not only C.Q. Brown, but also the Chief of Naval Operations and the Vice Chair of the Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs being sacked tonight. This is something that will sort of go down in history, not only for that, but because of the person that the president has now appointed, Dan Kane, a lieutenant general who did not have any of the prerequisite jobs that typically, under a law, someone is supposed to have before they become chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The president can waive that, but historically we've seen a real step up ladders so that you end up with somebody who really knows what they're doing in that job.
It's important to note that General Brown is the son of an Army colonel and Vietnam vet, a family who dedicated their lives to the U.S. military long before DEI initiatives even existed. John, we're also starting to see voters in Republican districts speak out against Elon Musk and the DOGE effort. Is that going to have an impact on Republicans? We watched that town hall down in Georgia, and though the voters were fired up, he kind of seemed snarky, like he didn't care.
Yeah, I mean, members of Congress don't care until they see their poll numbers go down, until they see their fundraising dry up, and until they start to believe that voters who voted for them were affected. So even in red districts, you'll have Democratic voters, and sometimes they will come to town halls. But what I've heard from folks on Capitol Hill working in Republican offices is that their phones have been ablaze. People do not like this ready, fire, aim approach to carving up government, to cutting government. A lot of people believe that there's waste in the federal government. A lot of people believe that it could be reorganized. But most of those people believe also that there should be an approach that isn't just get in there and break things. And part of the reason they believe that is because they like their country to be safe in terms of nuclear security, in terms of aviation security, in terms of, bless you, Stephanie, and in terms of other things that they expect from their government.
Sorry about the sneeze. Kurt, you have covered Donald Trump. You have known this man for years and years as a New York businessman, as a president, now president again. We're 1 month in. Where do you think we're headed? And is this what you expected?
It's worse than I expected. You know, with him, among other things, you have to determine how much is a lie, how much is bluster, how much is mental derangement, how much is, you know, ignorance. And you also, obviously, the bluster to he really does it ratio tends to be very high. So I'm a little surprised he is the Project 2025 agenda, which he said, I know nothing about it, I have nothing to do with these people, I don't know anything about it, is so manifestly what he's doing and following. So the fact that those kind of hard right ideologues that were Project 2025, who people didn't really think or at least I didn't, and many people, maybe everyone but Jason, believed that he wasn't really going to go all the way. But clearly he's gone all the way. And I think that the Steve Bannon famous 2019 quote, which about flooding the zone with
and burning it all down
crap, is what this is, you know, to an extreme, and has been very successful politically, media-wise, for this first month. For all the reasons you said earlier about people will get polls, people will hear from voters. We'll see how far that goes, and we'll see how many of these things actually get done between, and how much of a bulwark our judicial system, legal system is, which is, you know, pretty much until at least the midterms, all we got to hope for.
You are not surprised. We talked a lot about Project 2025 last year, and people laughed at us. I was on Bill Maher. He made fun of me. He said, that's just a Democratic talking point. But alas, here we are.
Oh, that's Bill. I will say this. It was really obvious that this is what he was going to do. And Stephanie, as somebody who spends part of my year in the D.C. metropolitan area, right, I'm around government employees all the time. I'm around the federal government. It's one of the largest employers in the region. And everybody was paying attention to this. And everybody knew how dangerous it was going to be. And it's not just what's happening with planes. It's not just farmers who are going to lose the opportunity to sell their goods to Bulgaria and stuff like that. It is small town people around the country in rural areas where the federal government is the best job you can get. That is the large negative impact. But I will say this. A lot of the people who are at these town halls and were very upset about this, I think a lot of people who voted for Trump, and I'm being as kind about this as possible, uncharacteristically kind. I think a lot of people who voted for Trump wanted to vote for him to get at other people who they didn't like, people who they thought weren't living the right way, weren't following the American dream, who were taking advantage of the system. But you forget that you're always somebody else, right? If you voted for Trump because you're like, he's going to get rid of those people, well, you know what? You're those people for somebody. And that's what's happening right now. People are finding out that as much as they may have disliked someone who they think was abusing the system in inner city Detroit, the fact that they were long-term employees of the federal government made them an enemy of people like Elon Musk. And that's what they're experiencing.
All right, well, we want to turn now to former Assistant Director for Counterterrorism at the FBI and MSNBC Senior National Security Analyst Frank Figliuzzi. Okay, Frank, so what is your reaction? We were talking a little bit before you came on about what we were just talking about, 1,000 people at FBI headquarters being reassigned rather quickly.
Yeah, it's a grand gesture to fulfill what has been a promise of Patel's. I'm going to drastically reduce the headquarters component. The problem is my sources are telling me there's no logic here. In other words, the people don't know where they're going. They're not even sure if it's them that's going to be named in this. There's more details coming.
And there's not like a rhyme or reason to what departments, what roles?
Right. There's been apparently no thought about, hey, Cleveland needs more agents. Maybe we'll send 2 there. There's nothing like that going on right now. So premature. With regard to the Huntsville, Alabama location, there's a couple of congressmen who've been banging the desk about getting people to Huntsville and to their territory. That's what that's about.
So you're hearing some of these agents are going to be reassigned from Washington, D.C. to Huntsville, Alabama?
Will mostly be non-agent support, professional support analysts, non-agent functions that really you could do from anywhere. But again, as you mentioned, the disruption to families, big deal.
I also want to ask you about what we were just talking about, this police database, this DOJ database. You know, it came from law enforcement who said there was criticism from law enforcement that said they didn't like it because they weren't given a chance to defend themselves. What's your take on that? Were there problems with this database, and should it still exist?
So what the claims have been is, look, our name got in this database because, but there's been no due process. I was fired wrongly. No one's looked into this. There's minor offenses that are in the database, and there's serious misuse of force cases. The problem is it's all gone now. And so if a federal officer who's been disciplined wants to kind of go around and find a way to get employed somewhere, no one has a real way to find out what that officer's background was.
But this database has only existed for a few years. How were they tracking this before, or were they just not tracking it?
Good question. They were not tracking this before. And in fact,
at all?
You know, no. And so officers, bad officers could move around the country, even within their own state, and not necessarily have anyone know what their history was. What I'm concerned about is, what does this mean from a larger sense? Does it mean the Trump administration won't be opening cases against bad cops, won't be working civil rights and excessive use of force cases? Do they care anymore? That remains to be seen.
So what accountability backstops are there at state or local jurisdictions to prevent some of the things we've just been talking about, to track bad cops and make sure they're not getting rehired?
It is continually shocking to me that there's not enough tracking taking place, even within the same state. So there's got to be more money spent on vetting an officer candidate, particularly coming from some other department.
Yeah.
Why did you leave? Let's pull the file. Let's go over that. There was talk of a national police database, just like this federal one that's been eliminated. And that now seems to be falling by the wayside.
Well, that's my next question is, do you see or foresee a ripple effect going through DOJ with this decision about other police reforms, about other law enforcement reforms?
Yeah, I think this is a signal. This is how I see it. If you've deliberately got the president saying, I want that database to go away, and it was his idea in the first place during his last term, then that's not a mistake DOJ is making. That's a decision that Donald Trump is making.
Any other things stand out to you about this database or about what you've been seeing at the FBI, at the DOJ that really concern you?
Yeah, look, generally with Kash Patel in power now, he's arrived. He's on the 7th floor. He's clearing the place out. And the big concern is, what will the FBI not be working, right? He said they're cops. They should be working murder and rape. Someone needs to tell him murder and rape in and of themselves are not federal crimes. Agents are not really cops in the sense of that. We don't have a national police force. My question, is he going to try and turn the FBI into a national police force, a secret police force for Donald Trump?
All right. And on that cheerful note, Frank Figliuzzi, thank you so much for joining us.